Thank you very much for coming along to see my show. Thanks. I'm glad that yeah, wow, lots of people. Great. Fantastic. By the way, if you're wondering, looking over here and thinking, gee, that flyering Peter did at the old people's home's really paying off. Now, this is my mum, Jeanette. Sit up. Now, I'm a gentleman. I won't say how old my mum is, but I'll just say that she was born in the same year that the Sydney Harbour Bridge opened. But as far as I know, she's never had Paul Hogan come around and do regular maintenance on it. That song came on to Advance Australia Fair is quite significant because the Australian Socceroos were the first sporting team to have that played as the national anthem. That's because in 1973 for their game against Iraq was the first event that Gough Whitlam appeared at as Australian Prime Minister officially, and he insisted on having Advance Australia Fair as the national anthem rather than God Save the Queen. Good on Gough. Which also meant that the Australian soccer team was the first team to ever have to mouth the words of Advance Australia Fair. And the coach at the time was a fellow called Rali Razic, who was born in Bosnia, and he was an orphan. He was orphaned during the Second World War. He came over to coach the Australian team, and the night before the game he had to teach the words of Advance Australia Fair to the Aussie soccer team. And he was later, one of the reasons why he was not brought back as coach was that he was considered a bit too ethnic. Now, he knew the words of Advance Australia Fair, so how un-Australian can you get, obviously? But he was standing next to Gough when the anthem was played, and he noticed that tears were streaming down Gough Whitlam's face when the anthem was being played, and he said to him, "Lad, surely you hear this song 5 or 6 times a day?" And Gough said, "It doesn't matter, I always cry." Now, I'm going to be talking about soccer for the next hour, so if you're not a soccer fan, this is going to be a very, very long hour. If you are a soccer fan, then you're used to being in an uncomfortable chair watching 90 minutes of pointless action. So this should be a breeze. I'm going to talk about an event called the World Cup. Now, that's an event held every 4 years to find the premier soccer nation in the world. They have qualifying rounds to get into the World Cup. They held it in America in 1994. That was very confusing for the Americans. It was a sporting event with world in the title, but other countries were competing. But I'm going to take you back now, back to the 1970s. Now, this was an era when no one drew pictures on top of your coffee. There was only one type of Kit Kat. The streets were basically paved with dog poo. TV was black and white, and everyone smoked. Basically, surgeons would smoke during operations. And if you were a soccer fan in the early 1970s, you were part of an oppressed minority. And it wasn't just soccer fans being paranoid. There were quite powerful vested interests who did not want soccer to become popular. They were the media, Aussie Rules, people in power in Aussie Rules, people in power in rugby league. So if you were a soccer fan then, you had pretty much a very bad case of short guy syndrome. Short supporter syndrome, basically. You kind of felt very badly oppressed, but you're the sort of person who would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch nil or draw and think, that was fantastic. And you're the sort of person who looked at Johnny Warren's hair and thought, how on earth does that stay up? There's just not that much KO in the world. There's Johnny over there. And Johnny Warren's autobiography was called Sheilas, Wogs and Poofters. That basically was what you were considered if you were a soccer player when Johnny Warren was growing up in the 50s and 60s. And anyway, Johnny was quite a hero of mine. But in case we didn't know our place, someone had very thoughtfully graffitied the words "Wog Ball" on the posts at Pico's Park number 4, and no one bothered to remove that for quite a few years. Now, there were a few guys at my school who had very, very thick brows, their knuckles dragged along the ground, and they had trouble with verbs and stuff. But they were the guys who played rugby league. Now, I actually like rugby league, and I grew up in a household where I had one fanatical rugby league parent and one parent who just loathed rugby league with a passion. Now, the parent who loved rugby league was my mum. My dad hated rugby league, which basically meant I didn't actually go see a live rugby league game until I was about 15 years old. Now, that's not actually true. I did go to the 1964 Rugby League Grand Final in September of 1964. St George Dragons versus Balmain, part of the 11 premierships in a row that St George Dragons won. That's not particularly relevant to the story. I just like saying that. Now, that was in September of 1964. I was born in October of 1964. Didn't have much of a view of the game, to be honest. But Dad hated rugby league. Now, I'm not quite sure. He just thought it was a buffets game. He grew up on the south coast, which was quite a strong soccer, sort of a stronghold. And he used to play soccer on Hurstville Station with rolled up pairs of socks while waiting for the train to take him home from school. So, as a family, from about the age of 4, most Sunday afternoons, my sisters included, we trooped off down to Hurstville Oval to watch St George Budapest play. Now, they were probably the best club team in Australia at the time. But I'll give you an idea how low rent Hurstville Oval was. We had to take our own chairs. We set them up behind the goal. And perhaps to give you a bit of an idea how low rent soccer was, we went to the 1971 Grand Final, the biggest club soccer match in Australia at the Sydney Sports Ground. Australia versus Western Suburbs, and we took our cat. Now, they search the bags in the way into the ground these days. I'm not sure if a terrorist would have a reason to bring a cat in, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to get a cat into the biggest soccer match of the year these days. But Hurstville Oval was a lovely old Art Deco ground. We always sit behind the goalposts to watch the game in our seats. And Dad would install good sportsmanship. We'd always clap the opposing team when they walked onto the field. We would always give them a hand. If an injured man from the opposing team went down and got up again, we'd always clap. And we'd be very respectful of other countries' national anthems. We would clap the other team if they won the match. Now, that was the good sportsmanship that Dad instilled in me. Now, Mum had a slightly different definition of good sportsmanship. Now, if she didn't like a referee's decision, this is what she would yell out.
Swallow your bloody whistle!
And if one of the opposing team came down injured, she had this medical advice for them.
Get up, you log!
So it was quite a lot of fun at Hurstville Oval. Now, along with Johnny Warren, these people were basically my heroes. Now, when you're 5, Johnny Warren was my hero. Also playing for St George, a fellow called Manfred Schaefer, the man with the most German name in history. Manfred was a milkman by trade. All the soccer players in Australia at this point in time were part-time players. They would train. They would work 8-hour days, and then they would train 3 days a week after work. We also had a fellow called Dag Uchesenovic. He was from somewhere in Yugoslavia. He was an insurance clerk. We had Otia Bodney, he was a house painter, he came from Hungary. We had a fellow called Georgie Harris, he was from England, and a fellow called Harry Williams, who was an Australian Aborigine, also known as Fancy Nancy, because he was a very skillful guy. But basically, the St George Budapest soccer team basically kind of looked like the SBS Weekend News team. And it was kind of, being a soccer fan was a crash course in Australian immigration in the post-war years. Now, a big game at Hurstville Oval would draw about 3,000 people inside the ground, plus about 50 Hungarian blokes who would line up along the fence from outside the ground but still be able to see the game from where they were standing. And a big game would be against a team such as Harkoa, who were the Jewish team from the eastern suburbs, or Marconi, who were the Italian team, or Apia, another Italian team, or Croatia, or obviously the Croatian team, Jugol, who were the Serbian team, Panhellenic, the Greek team, Prague, the Czech team, who eventually amalgamated with Jugol to form the quite unlikely geographical combination of Jugol-Prague. Polonia, the Polish team, Melita Eagles, the Maltese team. Although there was one team who were purely a district team with no kind of ethnic affiliation, Sutherland Shire. Who'd have thought? But we didn't actually use the term ethnic then. We had a much liked team called New Australians. And I like that. I like that term because that just suggests that these people, they were Australians, they were just fresh out of the box. They were the New Australian. I like that a lot. Now, so we didn't get much coverage in the press if you were a soccer fan, and you're considered a bit weird. But everybody played soccer. Every kid played soccer, even if they didn't actually support the teams. And I played for Peakhurst United in a team called the 6C2s. Now, we weren't good enough to be the number 1 C grade team. And now, when people talk about soccer, they talk about the formation, they talk about 4-4-2, how teams line up 4 defenders, 4 midfielders, 2 forwards, or 4-4-3. Now, in the under-6s, and this is a time when the under-6s didn't play like little 4-a-side games with tiny goals in little fields. We played 11-a-side, the big grown-up man's fields, and we kept the score. Because we were allowed to lose in the 1970s. 5-year-olds were allowed to feel the bitter pain of defeat, and they learned how to cop it on the chin when they were 5 rather than reach the age of, say, 21 and find out that the world isn't going to give them everything they wanted. So we kept the score, we knew who were winning, and we knew that the losers didn't feel very good about it, because that's what made it fun. Now, we didn't play 4-4-2 in the under-6s, it was 10. One great big pack of kids just chasing them. Well, I'll say 10. In the Peakhurst United under-6C2s, it was 9-1. 9 kids chasing the ball in the pack and me. I was walking along the sidelines pretending they were roads and I was a semi-trailer. And I'd make my appropriate semi-trailer noises too whenever I got to the side and did a turn. Now, if the ball did happen to come my way, what did I do?
Grabbed your willy, went round and round, twirled round and round with excitement.
Actually, you're supposed to talk about that goal I scored. Matt's play, not much changed, did it, Matt? Now, we didn't just play on the weekends, we played at school. Now, in the kindergarten, we couldn't bring our ball to school. We used to play with a stone. So we'd kick a stone from one end of the playground. That, by the way, Mum, is why I went through so many pairs of Barter Scouts. In case you're wondering. And then when we got a bit older, you bring a ball to the school, you bring it in a little string bag, and you turn up the school gates, and the kids would be excited to see, look, Peter's ball is here, and off they go and play. Now, if you grew up in, say, England and you played soccer at school, you'd form your teams, and if you lived in Liverpool, one team would be Liverpool, one team would be Everton. If you grew up in Spain, you'd be Real Madrid, Barcelona. If you grew up in London, you'd be Chelsea, and you'd be Arsenal. Not at Penshurst West Primary School. We divided ourselves into two teams, the Wogs against the Aussies. And everyone pretty much just filed into their teams and didn't particularly find that disturbing. Pretty much, probably because the Wogs had the better players, I don't know. But it was at a soccer match that I discovered that I was an Australian. I'd heard the word being bandied around. I didn't really know what it meant. But in 1969, I went to the Sydney cricket ground to watch Australia play Greece. And I found out I was supposed to be supporting the Australians. Oh, fine. I'm an Australian. Fantastic. There were these other people there, probably about half the crowd. They were these people called Greeks. Didn't quite know much about them, but they spoke a bit funny. They had olive skin. I just assumed they had a much longer drive home. And because of this sort of thing where most of the club sides had a kind of an ethnic following, there were a lot of alienated football fans, soccer fans in Sydney and Australia-wide. And so the Australian national team sort of became the de facto club side for a lot of soccer fans in Australia. And so they became that team that you live and die by. These guys, I said, these are my heroes, and these are the heroes you have when you're 5 years old. So these are guys who can do no wrong. Now, you grow out of that. You eventually learn that your heroes are human, they have frailties, they can make mistakes. Unless, of course, your name is Piers Ackerman and you're writing about someone from the Liberal Party. In which case, they can still do no wrong. But I became quite a fanatical soccer fan, and if you're a fanatical soccer fan in the 70s, there were two things you wanted to see. You wanted to see Australia beat a team from another country, and you wanted to see Australia make the World Cup finals. Now, in 1972, we went to the Sydney Sports Ground. That was the ground now stands where, what stands there now is the Sydney Football Stadium, or whatever, Allianz, whatever it's called this week. The team came out to play against Australia called Santos. They were a Brazilian club side, and their star player was Pelé. He was the best player in the world, and 30,000 fans crammed into the Sydney Sports Ground to watch the best player in the world. And before the game, the Brazilian players come out onto the ground to warm up, and they start doing this thing, ball juggling. Just keeping the ball in the air with their feet about 30 times in a row. And 30,000 Australian soccer fans just stared at them like they were space aliens. They'd never seen anything quite like this at all, and that just was kind of put the Australian game in perspective. Because we knew that there were about another 150 million back home in Brazil who could do the same thing. But 29,998 people went home a little bit disappointed from that game, because they came to see Pelé play. And what happened was that a fellow called Ray Richards marked Pelé out of the game. Ray Richards was a very sturdy Australian centre half, had a 1970s porn moustache. Basically sat on Pelé for 90 minutes, didn't let the man breathe. And two people went home quite happy, Ray Richards and me. Okay, good on you, Ray. But anyway, what Australians wanted to do was qualify for the World Cup. Now, so in 1973, the first round of qualifications for the World Cup came around. Now, the Australian captain at the time was a fellow called Peter Wilson. He was a very tall bloke, long blonde hair, looked a bit like Jesus, was pretty much as hard to kill. Peter Wilson epitomised the fullback's motto, he can't run without legs. He was the captain of the Australian team, and he was another hero of mine. But the team that we had to get through the first round of qualifying in 1973 was a country called Iraq. Now, they've never been in the news again since then. I mean, one thing about being a soccer fan in the 70s, there was a great geography lesson. Australia had to travel, between 1966 and 1974, Australia travelled 85,000 kilometres to get to their World Cup games. They played World Cup qualifiers in every continent in the world because we were like a minnow and we were just thrown wherever. Anyway, this time around we had to qualify through Asia. Now the first game, our coach I say at the time was a fellow called Raleigh Razik, a war orphan. He was an orphan because his mother had been beaten to death. His uncle had been beaten to death. Now if you're wondering why people from other countries would like to come to Australia and live in places like Auburn and find that better than where they are, understand that in Australia you're not going to get beaten to death by your political opponents. Unless, of course, you're running against Tony Abbott in the Sydney University Council election. Who knows? Anyway, so Raleigh Razik came to Australia to play in the early 60s. In 1969 was made the coach of the Australian team basically because he owned a tracksuit and a ball. But he had a very professional attitude and he got the team playing very well. Now, against Iraq, he'd done his homework and he found that the Iraqi team liked to wear moulded football studs, which meant that they couldn't adjust the length of their studs for the conditions. So on the day of the game against Iraq, the ground happened to be very, very, very wet, but slipperier than Rod Hull's roof, as they say. So the Iraqis turn up with their very short moulded studs, just slide all over the place. Australia have their long studs in, win the game 3-1. We go through to the next round, and the next day, Raleigh Razik particularly thanked the groundsman. The next game was against Iran, the one with the N, not the Q. Now we win that's the two-league game. We win the first league 3-0 in Sydney. Australia has to go play Iran. Now we get up in the middle of the night. Now if you're a soccer fan, you get used to getting up in the middle of the night because basically important soccer matches are played in important parts of the world. They're generally in different time zones. So we're up in the middle of the night to watch Australia versus Iran. This is played in front of 120,000 men. So in Iran, chicks aren't allowed to go to the soccer. So if there is an Islamic revolution, one good point. But anyway, we're watching the game on the ABC in black and white. About 20 minutes into the game, Australia is 2-0 down, and the satellite just drops out. So we have to listen to the rest of the game on the radio, edge of our seats. Australia gets through, survives, goes through the next round. They beat South Korea. Australia is in the World Cup finals. This is huge. Australian soccer fans jump up and down. We're in the World Cup finals. Hey, how about that? We're the best sporting event in the world. And the rugby league fans go, good on you. Go and enjoy a little competition. Now, before we play in the World Cup finals, we play a warm-up game against a team called Uruguay. And now my dad was a very nice man. My dad would have trouble booing Hitler. In the Uruguay game, a disgruntled Uruguayan fullback runs 50 metres across the field with his hand raised in a karate chop motion, chops the Australian forward Ray Bartz in the back of the neck with something that Bruce Lee would be quite proud of. Ray Bartz goes down like a sack of spuds, and I heard my dad booing. I've never heard this noise. My dad never even swore. Like one time he was putting some wallpaper up, he said, "Darn it!" Birds stopped chirping. Mothers came out from the streets with mixing bowls. What's going on? And Dad was booing, and I've never heard this noise before. And so since that time, and a lot of us Australian soccer fans have this, we just don't like Uruguay. I'm sure it's a nice place, the pointless little country wedged in there between Argentina and Brazil and a bit of land that no one really wanted. Look, I even once made out with a Uruguayan girl. But no, as far as I'm concerned, Uruguay can go fart in a jar. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, Australia makes it to the World Cup finals. Here we are. And some countries aren't happy with this. England are not very happy because they didn't qualify. And they're saying, how can these colonials be playing in the World Cup final when England isn't there? And there's a German newspaper called the Bild Zeitung. They had a headline, who are these kangaroo no-hopers? Or kangaroo Taugenitz. German for no-hoper. Learned a lot of good German swear words as a soccer fan. Anyway, the Australians, they line up for their first game against East Germany. They were called the DDR, for the German Democratic Republic, because communists like a good ironic joke as much as anyone. And again, we're rugged up in the middle of the night, it's June, it's very cold, we've got our blankets on, we've got the black and white TV on, we've got our hot chocolate. And we're expecting to see Australia get hammered, because the other no-hopers, Haiti had been beaten 7-0 by Poland, Zaire had been beaten 9-0 by Yugoslavia, so these Germans are expecting Australia to get caned in the same way. Well, at half-time, the score is still 0-0, and the East Germany boo their team as they walk off the field. Australia comes back, we get beaten 2-0, there's two very good goals that need to put us away. The next game is against West Germany. They are aristocrats of world football. Players in the team, Sepp Maier, probably the best goalkeeper in the world at the time, Gerd Müller, the best forward in the time, a fellow called Wolfgang Overrath, the second most German name in history, and a fellow called Franz Beckenbauer, who is still today, when people list their top 11 footballers of all time, Franz Beckenbauer is listed as a centre back. Anyway, their fans expect Australia to get taken apart. I mean, lining up against them, the part-timers. And then about halfway through the second half, West Germany, they're 3-0 up. And Australia do something which they continually do over the next 20 years. They start to play. They look around and they thought, hang on, these guys are full-time professionals, we're just, milkmen. But they start to play the game, and they start to pass the ball, they start to put West Germany on the back foot. And Franz Beckenbauer just starts dribbling the ball towards his own goal line. He doesn't want to go forward anymore. A, because he doesn't want to concede a goal and get embarrassed in front of his fans, and B, he's shit scared of Peter Wilson and Ray Richards. And so the West German crowd start whistling their own team and booing and catcalling them. And Otti Abonyi breaks away, has a shot at goal, hits the inside of the post, bounces back out. And that is the closest Australia comes to scoring a goal in a World Cup final for 32 years. The Bild Zeitung issue an apology. We called these people Australians the kangaroo no-hopers. We apologise. They have done their country proud. They are not no-hopers. Good luck, Aussies. Australia comes home, of course, to the Australian Soccer Federation laying on, a ticker tape parade, masses of receptions, the newspapers laud our cheek. Of course not. They come home to nothing. What's the time? Where are we going?
8:05.
8:05. That's about half time, I reckon. Can we have some oranges, please? Thank you. Mum was the most important person in the soccer team when I was growing up. She was the orange lady. And the orange lady would come on at half time and provide oranges. So I'm going to give you one of your dose of vitamin C. And please, if you can, pick up your pills afterwards so that Lonely Armin doesn't have to chip on them.
Thank you very much.
Now what happens afterwards is the man who has gotten Australia to the World Cup final, is he reappointed coach of Australia? Of course not. He resigns, expecting to be reappointed, because there's been some friction between Riley Razik and a fellow called Arthur George, who was the head of the federation. Basically because Riley Razik had grabbed Sir Arthur George by the throat and held him up against a wall during a disagreement during one of the games, and also because Riley Razik had been quite a vocal supporter of Gough Whitlam, and Sir Arthur George was a vocal supporter of the Liberal Party. And basically, he wasn't invited back as coach. Now, Australia decided to go for English coaches, because England had done so well at the last World Cup by not being there. We appointed a guy called Brian Green. Brian Green lasted 18 months as the coach of the Australian soccer team before he was arrested for shoplifting 2 LPs from Nicholson's record shop in Manly. Which is sad, because our man we appointed as our coach was a shoplifter, and sad because we didn't pay him enough so he could buy his own Max Buy grades out. But anyway, they held interviews for the next coach, and so Riley Razik came to be interviewed, Johnny Warren came to be interviewed, and another fellow called Jimmy Shoulder threw his hat into the ring just for the hell of it. Riley Razik walks into the interview room, the panel says, "So tell us, what have you done for Australian soccer?" This is the man who has just taken them to the World Cup final. His reply is unprintable, and he storms out of the room. In walks Johnny Warren to be interviewed. He has been the captain of the Australian soccer team, probably the best player in Australian soccer history. He's just coached Georgia Budapest to a grand final win. He gets asked the same question: "Can you tell us what you've ever done for Australian soccer?" His reply was 2 words long. One of them was off. So he storms out, and Riley Razik is still there fuming. He's only about a minute later. So they do the Aussie thing, they go to the pub together and get very, very drunk. Which left Jimmy Shoulder as the coach of the Australian soccer team pretty much by default. Now, Jimmy Shoulder was a 28-year-old Englishman. He played for Hartlepool and the Vancouver Royals. Now, I'll give you some perspective. Hartlepool have a record of being the team that has been in the English football leagues for the longest time without ever reaching higher than the 3rd division. And their mascot is a monkey, because during the Napoleonic Wars, the people of Hartlepool lynched a monkey in the belief that it was a French spy. And the Vancouver Royals are from Canada. Anyway, Jimmy Shoulder, from all accounts, a nice affable bloke. So's my dad, but I wouldn't give him the job of coaching the Australian soccer team. He did coach the 13C Peakers United team to a premiership in 1977. So he has a better coaching record than Jimmy Shoulder. Jimmy Shoulder basically had one trick. He'd warm up his subs whenever the team was playing badly, and the guys on the field would pull their finger out and start to play better. But anyway, Australia plays Iran in Melbourne in 1977 in their first qualifying game to get to their World Cup finals in Argentina in 1978. They get awarded a penalty kick halfway through the first half. A fellow called Harding walks up to take the kick and does, in classical under-sixes penalty kick taking style, closes his eyes, lifts his head, kicks the ball about 10 foot over the post. Iran win the game 1-0. That's the end of Australia in the 1978 World Cup finals. That's the end of Jimmy Shoulder. Riley Razik sits at home by the phone waiting for a call to become the next Australian coach. Phone never rings. Who we get instead appointed to take the team to the World Cup finals in 1982 in Spain is a man called Rudi Gutendorf. Rudi bloody Gutendorf. Rudi Gutendorf was quite a wealthy man. He didn't need to be coaching soccer teams because he owned a toothbrush factory. That was how he made his money. But he also had quite another record. Rudi Gutendorf has the world record for most number of national teams coached. Rudi Gutendorf has been the coach of 18 different national soccer teams. Now he was, in 1976 alone, the year before he was appointed Australian coach, he coached Antigua Botswana, Grenada, Tanzania. Not bad credentials if you want to be a cricket coach. Bit dodgy for a soccer coach. Now, Rudi Guttendorf, as I've been pointed by 18 different teams. Now, that suggests one of two things. That says that Rudi Guttendorf is a fantastic coach and he is very much in demand. Or that Rudi Guttendorf is an idiot and he gets sacked a lot. I basically think Rudi Guttendorf, one of those people who was excellent, and this is just something that doesn't just happen in soccer, happens across every industry. I mean, he was excellent at job interviews. Anyway, Rudi Guttendorf is appointed the coach, and the team that knocks us out after 2 games into our run to go to the World Cup finals in Spain in 1982, and it's very hard to say, was New Zealand. Now, Rudi Guttendorf goes on a spying mission to see how New Zealand play. And New Zealand are playing a game in Fiji. Rudi Guttendorf takes a taxi to the ground, and at the end of the game, he notices that there's not that many taxis in Fiji. He has to walk home. He's walking down the road away from the ground, and what pulls up beside him is the New Zealand team bus. And someone says, "Isn't that the Australian coach? Let's pick him up and give him a lift." And by all accounts, Rudi Guttendorf gets on like a house on fire with the New Zealanders. And they don't mind, they think they've got us rattled anyway. I think he's kind of already edging towards his next coaching appointment. You know, Rudi Guttendorf tries to instill a bit of European professionalism. What he does, he gets the Australian team in camp 1 week before the main game against New Zealand, gives them an intensive training session in the morning, gives them a siesta in the afternoon, another intensive training session in the evening. The siesta time he picks is 3 o'clock. Now this is an important time because the match against New Zealand is played at 3 o'clock. The Sydney Fringe, we watched the Australian team sort of make their way onto the field. Some of them got their pillows. And basically they're very, very lethargic. Fella in goal called Greg Woodhouse kind of lets the ball just slip under him and toddles him into the goal. We're down 1-0, we're thinking, it's New Zealand, why should we panic? We concede a second goal 10 minutes in the end. We think, time to panic. It's too late, we're done. New Zealand has knocked us out. That's the end of Rudi bloody Guttendorf. Goodbye. Now, the next coach appointed for Australia is a fellow called Frank Mad Dog Arok. I love Frank Mad Dog Arok. He used to coach St George in the early 70s. He understands Australian soccer. He's a Hungarian former sports journalist, knows how to work the press, likes to play mind games. Anyway, Australia's put in what's called the Oceania group, which is basically Australia, New Zealand and any other country no one else in the world wants to play against. So we've got New Zealand, we have Taiwan and we have Israel. Now, back in the 1980s, soccer was a less delicate game. To get sent off in a soccer match in the 80s, you basically had to murder someone. Frank Mad Dog Arok, our coach, gets sent off in the game in Israel. He has to watch the rest of the game from behind a barbed wire fence standing on a milk crate. I kind of hoping that Manfred Schaefer is at home thinking, look at that. I know the make and model of that milk crate. In the post-match, we win the game in Israel. Australia, this is probably the best team Australia's had for 12 years. The post-match press conference, Frank Howard says to the gathered Israeli press, they thought that we were going to play like mad dogs, but instead we play football. This was translated to the Israelis as, we think your team are mad dogs, but instead you turned out to be vicious and dirty. Now the Israelis don't like being called mad dogs. Apparently some fella called Hitler used to use that term talking about Jewish people in the middle of the 20th century. So this causes quite a diplomatic incident, and the Australian ambassador has to go to visit the Israeli ambassador, and peace is made. So Israel comes back to face Australia in Melbourne, and they line up to hear their national anthem before the game. This is the song that gets played. If you can for me there, please, Jerry.
Yep.
Hand on heart.
Oh no!
Now, apparently the previous game that Israel had played was against the West German under-20 team, and they hadn't wound the tape back. Now, I don't think Frank Arrock has anything to do with this, but if I'm sure he was secretly thinking. Anyway, we beat Israel. We have to play Scotland. We're excited. We think we can beat Scotland. They're coached by a guy called Jock Stein. He's an old-fashioned coach. His tactics are now years old. We can take these blokes. Jock Stein drops dead the night that Scotland qualified. He's replaced as coach of Scotland by some guy. You may have heard of him. His name is Alec Ferguson. He's been coaching Manchester United for the past 27 years, basically the best soccer coach in the world. So we go off to play Scotland in Scotland. Now Frank Arrock invites the press in to watch our training session. Before the session he goes to the Australian players, look, just as a bit of a joke, I want you guys to just be mad dogs and just kick the hell out of each other in the training session. we want the Scots to be slightly intimidated. So Australia, the press file in, and the Australians just, it's like the 1973 grand final. It's just on for young and old. Australia's having a ball. And it works a bit too well because the referees get wind of this, so they just penalise. They think Australia is just going to be absolutely brutal. They penalise the hell out of them in the game against Scotland. We get beaten 2-0. We had to come back to play the next game in Australia. As he's leaving, Frank Arrock says, "Don't forget to pack your sunscreen." And Frank Arrock tries to get the return game played at Darwin at 12 midday. Unfortunately, the Australian Soccer Federation decides to play the game in Melbourne at 8 o'clock at night, so they want to get a bigger crowd. Totally missing out on the fact that if the Scotland's kind of evaporate, we'll go to the World Cup final, we'll get lots of money. Anyway, Scotland holds on for nil or draw. We don't qualify. Now, it's starting to become a thing. Australia not qualifying for the World Cup final. So the soccer fair is starting to become an obsession. Anyway, Frank Arrock is retained as coach. Australia goes off to play in the Olympic Games in 1988 in Korea. On the plane on the way over, there's the whole Australian Olympic team, including the soccer team. And every other Olympic athlete is in training for the Olympic Games. They've been training for 4 years. They're on very strict diets. Australian soccer team was on a plane in the 1980s. They see one thing: free piss. Australian soccer team is absolutely blind on them. They get to the Olympic Village, the piss up continues. They're just the FIFA officials calling Frank Arrock before the game and say, "Look, Frank, Australia's, we're glad you qualified for this kind of thing. It's what we have is something called the Fair Play Award, and we think Australia should try and win the Fair Play Award because if you play well, if you play in the spirit of the game, we're going to give you this little trophy that says you won the Fair Play Award. How's that, Frank?" And Frank said, "You can stick your Fair Play Award up your bottom. We're here to win this thing. Throw your ball dust." And he said ball dust because that's the kind of words Frank Arrock used, out the window. So Australia beats Yugoslavia in the first round, beats Nigeria, gets through to play Russia in the quarter-final. Australian centre forward David Mitchell kicks a Russian in the nuts, gets sent off. West Germany ends up getting awarded the Fair Play Award. Australia again has to beat Israel and New Zealand to get through to the World Cup finals in 1990. We get beaten again by New Zealand. The game is held as a warm-up to a rugby match. That's how important New Zealanders think the game is. So there's about 1,000 people there, plus these confused rugby fans wandering and going, "Hey, We have a soccer team, bro. Oh, look, we're beating Australia. Oh, we have a soccer team. Oh. Because, and the New Zealand team do this thing which basically they're shit at everything unless they're doing it against Australia. So we get beaten 2-0. We have to beat Israel in Sydney. Now this game is held the day after what's known as the Hillsborough disaster. 70 or 80 people get killed in a football stadium in England because of bad crowd management. 45,000 people go to watch the game at the Sydney Football Stadium, a ground that holds 40,000 people. They were 45,000 of the best behaved soccer fans ever. I've never seen so much politeness because this Hillsborough's still in everyone's mind. After you, no, after you. Everyone's incredibly nice and supportive to each other. Australia's captain Charlie Yankos, the most reliable man in Australian soccer, trips over the ball. Ball rolls on, the Israeli centre forward scores the goal. Australia gets an equaliser very late in the game. That's not enough. And the referee is supposed to add on about 10 minutes of injury time because the Israeli players playing for time developed something called a brittle bone syndrome. Basically drop on the ground in a screaming funk if anyone much as looks at them, and then get miraculously cured by the sideline as they're being carried over on the stretcher. Well, the referee awards no injury time at all. Frank Howard spends his last time as Australian coach waving his watch at the referee and basically turning the air blue with language. Anyway, Australia now has to qualify for the 1994 World Cup finals. It's now 20 years since we qualified for the World Cup finals. It's really becoming a thing. The team we have to beat this time around is called Argentina. And they're on a bit of a down curve. They've just been beaten 5-0 by Colombia. So what they do is they recall a guy to their team who hasn't been picked for 18 months. A fella called Diego Maradona. The reason why he hasn't been picked for 18 months is because he got busted with cocaine in his system. Anyway, we all file in to watch the game against Argentina at the Sydney Football Stadium, 45,000 people, the biggest game ever in the history of Australian soccer. On runs Maradona, stops at the centre line to snort the line. Plays absolutely out of his skin. Has a guy called Paul Wade sitting on him, stuck on him faithfully for about 89 minutes, turned his back for a second, Maradona gets away, passes. Argentina scores a goal. We get a 1-1 draw, but we get to play them in Argentina. We lose 1-0, we're out of the World Cup. Maradona goes on to the World Cup finals in Argentina where he celebrates a goal by running towards a cameraman, screaming with his mouth open, leaps the fence, eats a small child. He tests positive for cocaine and gets sent home in disgrace. Anyway, now it's 24 years since we now qualified for the World Cup finals, but we have the best Australian team ever. Up front, for the 1997 World Cup qualifiers, we have Harry Kewell, Mark Viduka, we have the Vidmar brothers, we have Mark Bosnich in goals, we have Robbie Slater, we have Graham Arnold. Now, our coach is a fellow called Terry Venables. He speaks like a used car salesman out of Minder, but he's a very much in-demand coach. And we get him as our coach because one of the secretaries working at the Australian Soccer Federation used to work for the English Soccer Federation, calls up a friend who's a stenographer there, says, hey, can you ask Terry if he wants to come coach Australia? Terry Venables says, sure, why not? He gets sent a video of the Australian team playing. He likes that because it gets sent $500,000. He likes that too. We have to beat Iran. We go play Iran. In Iran, we get a 1-1 draw. That's a very good result. That means we have to come home, play against them in Australia. And if we get a 0-0 draw, that's good enough to get through on something called the away goals rule, which is based on that the team who scores the most away goals, if the scores are level, gets to go through to the next round. 100,000 people are watching the game at the MCG. Everyone is watching this on television in Australia. Soccer fans, non-soccer fans, because they think, well, if we win this game, those soccer fans will shut up after 24 years of whinging. Anyway, 75 minutes into the game, Australia is 2-0 up. We're just toying with Iran like a cat toying with a little mouse. We're playing very good. Iran are basically under their shell. They're just thinking about the flight home and the non-alcoholic drinks they'll be getting stuck into. Except for the goalkeeper, he's thinking he's going to get his hands cut off. Anyway, what happens is a fellow runs out of the crowd, runs onto the field, jumps onto the goalpost, starts swinging on the goalpost. He's got some kind of personality disorder. Goalpost breaks. So there's about a 10-minute break while they get a new goalpost in. In this time, Australia goes off the boil. We resume the game with 15 minutes to play. Iran have had a bit of a rest, had a bit of a regroup, start playing all right, score a goal, an offside goal, a messy goal. Ball could have gone anywhere. I could see it was offside from my seat on the lounge at home. Apparently the referee didn't have the same view as me. So Australia are now 2-1 up, that's okay, we're still ahead. Iran scores another goal, suddenly the score is 2-2, and we're behind on the away goals rule. And Australia again starts to panic, we start to panic at home, it finishes at 2-2, Johnny Warren cries. So I hate Iran. Oh, where are we going? How much time we got left? Going to get the fourth official. Can you please tell me how much time we have? How much time we got to go here? How much have we got? There we go, Adam. Here we go. All right, 3 minutes. Okay. All right, Johnny Warren cries, I hate Iran. If we ever invade Iran, I'm going to punch them 3 times. Once for beating us, once for making Johnny Warren cry, and once for the Persian cats. They make me sneeze. 2001, we have to play Uruguay. We go to play them in Uruguay. We are met at the airport by hundreds of vicious and nasty Uruguayans who spit and punch our players as they get off the plane. They're not soccer fans, they're just typical Uruguayans. This causes a diplomatic incident, and Alexander Downer pulls in the Uruguayan ambassador, gives him a dressing down, and perhaps even scarier still, the Uruguayan ambassador has to go talk to Kerry O'Brien on 7:30 report. Anyway, Kerry O'Brien turns out to be the scariest Australian the Uruguayans come up against. We get beaten, we're out of the World Cup again. This time Tony Vidmar, our tough fullback, he cries. So I really hate Uruguayans. She made Tony Vidmar cry. Anyway, it's now 32 years since we have qualified for the World Cup finals, and in that we lose some people along the way. We lose Johnny Warren, we lose my dad. I'm not going to blame the Uruguayans for this. Johnny Warren was done in by cigarettes, Dad was done in by Christmas dinner. No, what the hell, I'm going to blame the Uruguayans. You made Johnny Warren cry and he killed him, and you knocked my dad off too. So anyway, for now for important soccer matches, we set up the photographs of all these missing people to watch the games along with us. We have to make sure that we turn Dad away from the screen for any important rugby league games. Books start to fall off the wall. Dad did watch one rugby league game in his life. He watched the first half of the 1999 grand final between St George Dragons and Melbourne. At half time, St George are winning 14-0. Dad goes out to do some gardening. We all come home very sad. Dad comes bounding in, unaware of the result. Said, good game, wasn't it? Paint comes off the walls. Anyway, when me and Mum attend Johnny Warren's funeral, very tastefully wearing our matching soccer shirts, because it's not weird for a grown man to dress the same as his mother. Both wearing our green and gold afro wigs. And we make the Channel 7 News as the 2 weirdest people to turn up to Johnny Warren's funeral. Anyway, I had to do something to go see the game in 2005 against Uruguay. I have to queue up for tickets. You never had to do this for a soccer match in the past, but to be at the Olympic Games Stadium with 85,000 people, I had to queue up at 8 o'clock in the morning at Ticket Check at the Macquarie Centre. But I get my tickets, me and Mum, we're up in the top decks in our afro wigs. Very, very high up. You can see the International Space Station below us as it passes. Mark Ricciano scores a goal, levels the score. Now, Uruguay can score at any time for the rest of the match. They would win the game on away goals, they would win the game on outright. They come within about an ant's dick of scoring, but scores are level at the end of the game. We have to go into what's called a penalty shootout. Now I'm going to recreate this moment for you all.
Another recreation.
Matt, you can help me with this.
Oh.
Yeah, up you go. Now I'm going to be Australian goal. I'm going to be the Uruguayan goalkeeper. I don't know what his name is. Something really stupid in Spanish. That's all I know. Matt's going to be John Aloisi, the Australian scorer. Now, earlier on in the, I want you all to be the Australian soccer team. Now you guys are all going to be linking arms with each other and standing in the centre circle. Then up, very good man, very good work. Now, earlier on the fellow who cried in Montevideo, Tony Vidmar, takes one of the earlier penalty kicks, scores the goal beautifully with his left foot. Tony Vidmar is a right-footed player. That's how cool Tony Vidmar is. Because what he knows is that goalkeepers will study opposing players and know how they kick penalties. So Tony Vidmar, in the most important penalty kick in his life, uses his bad foot, scores the goal. Doesn't get to go to the World Cup final because he finds he has a heart defect and is medically ruled out. Life sucks. Okay, now when Matt kicks this goal, and Matt, you're John Aloisi on the Uruguayan goalkeeper. I'm expecting you to kick it this way. You're not going to kick it that way. Because if you kick it that way, A, you'll hit my mum. B, you'll miss the goal. You're going to kick the ball here into the goal. When Matt kicks this goal, we're going to cheer out 32 years of pent-out frustration. We're also going to make a lot of noise so Mark Williamson there in the fuse box thinks I'm having a good show. Okay? Alright, Matt. This is your moment. Now if you kick this, we're all going to go and drive our cars up and down Norton Street afterwards, honking our horns all night. You understand that? Right, here we go, Matt. You're John Aloisi. Now when you kick this goal, you're going to run around there and take your shirt off. That is not. Right, here we go. Yeah! Very much. I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. I hope you found out a little bit more about the frustration of being a soccer fan. And thank you very much. And I think Terry on sound up the back there. I thank Kathryn, our fourth official. And I want to thank this lady here, my mum, for her contribution.